Well, hi, I'm Courtney. Welcome to my channel where we discuss educational research one study at a time so that you can incorporate it into your practice. Today is the third video in our series. We're taking a look at the research article Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert. If you haven't checked out the other videos in this series, I have them linked in a playlist below that you can go and review. We have already talked about the need for the alphabetic code, cracking the alphabetic code, which is the first video. The second one was all about reading at the word level. And now, today, for all of you people who have a rich background in whole language and are really eager to take some things that you've already been doing and not have them tossed out the window, this video is for you. This one is all about reading comprehension today. So follow along and we will use the research to explain why this is important. For those of you who are new here, this research article is part of the reference list in the news article Sold a Story. And there's also an associated podcast with it. And because I love research so much, I am going through the reference list that formed that article and taking a deep dive to just check that the research used in that article is in fact true research and what it does say, because there's so much more information out there that wasn't included in that article. And that makes sense because the article can't sum up an entire 50 years of research about reading. Alright, so when we're talking about the reading wars, a lot of the people who are against the phonics approach tend to be in favor of reading comprehension. And the researchers who are writing this article and who have synthesized all the other research that forms the information in this article aren't saying that comprehension isn't important. It absolutely is. What's the point of reading if we're not going to learn anything from it? But what they are saying is that if students don't know how to read in the first place, there's nothing for them to comprehend. You can't just move into the comprehension. There's a continuum that has to be followed, and the researchers are simply highlighting what that continuum entails. So now we find ourselves at the end of the continuum where we're focusing on comprehension. So comprehension in a written text goes beyond what's actually in the text. It includes the meaning that's made in the text and the background knowledge that forms the text, and also the background knowledge that a reader is bringing into the reading situation. One definition that the researchers turned to when describing reading comprehension was, reading comprehension is the process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. Because of this, oral language is super important for reading comprehension. One thing that the authors note right off the hop is that reading comprehension strategies are actually oral language comprehension strategies. So oral language comprehension serves reading comprehension. They're very connected, and so we can start the reading comprehension process and understanding way before students even know what letters are, because we can speak before we can read. So it's really important to let our students talk. Let them talk, tell their parents that it's good for them to talk, let them talk when they have time at school, and engage in really rich conversations that move beyond, I see a cat, I see a dog. Shake up the vocabulary, shake up the context, use synonyms, use antonyms, use homonyms, all the nyms, and talk about why you are doing that. Talk about things like the difference between picture and photo. They both can mean that you're taking a photograph of somebody, but a picture can go beyond that and be something that you color, whereas a photo can't. So build in opportunities like that in your discussions and make your conversations meaningful and authentic so that you do go beyond your regular vocabulary, and so that you are bringing in the need to explain yourself and clarify and summarize information with your students and with your children. Because even before reading starts, oral language is serving reading comprehension later. Alright, so how do we build good comprehension? Well, one area that's really related to strong comprehension for students is the ability to inference. And so students who are poor comprehenders really struggle with bringing ideas that they found from across a text. They're good at going straight to the text and finding a specific answer, but if we ask to make an inference that involves moving across the text at more than one point, it can be very challenging for students who are poor comprehenders, and they need help building that strategy. To improve inferencing, working memory plays a big role here, and that makes sense because you have to hold information in your brain and be accessing new information at the same time. So there's a lot of cognitive demands that go into inferencing, and working memory is a big part of that. If we want to free up working memory for students, we'll talk about this a little later, but we need to make sure that they have a rich vocabulary so that they're not spending all their time wondering what words mean. We need as much resources as we can when we're inferencing, and so all of the pre-groundwork that goes into reading and reading well needs to be laid so that we can really focus on inferencing and making connections across texts. Now, there was a study that the researchers point to that accounted for this working memory situation that goes on. They had students look at a text, read it, and then they asked them questions about the text. The questions that required inferences required students to access different text premise points across the text. And so students who did really well in that area were also able to easily find out questions that didn't require inferences, where they just had to find specific information from the text. And so it's really limiting if students can't do that separate part of inferencing. If they can inference, we don't need to really worry about them being able to gather information from the text. But if they can only gather information from the text and they can't extend it beyond inferencing, then they kind of stall out in their ability to comprehend. So we need to find strategies to move them beyond that, and then inferencing will kind of take care of the rest for them. All right, well, how can we help our students build good inferencing skills? There's some good news here because it doesn't take too long. The researchers looked at a study where students received 8 30-minute lessons. So, I mean, it takes a bit of time to get going, but once they have that skill, they can use it for the rest of their academic careers. So 8 30-minute lessons, and they taught students how to use a graphic organizer that kind of linked information. So if we know this, we can know this, and if we know this, then it leads to this. And using those graphic organizers, students gained the skills that they needed to be able to inference quickly and effectively, and they outperformed all of their peers who didn't have these lessons. So it really was a worthwhile endeavor for educators to include that part of reading instruction for their students when you're focusing on inferencing. All right, let's head back to that idea of working memory that we touched on. For students to be able to inference and comprehend texts, they need a good deal of working memory available to them. But it's really interesting what type of working memory they need to be able to access. This comes from oral conversations, oral language practice. So there's research that shows that students who needed working memory for memorizing a string of numbers or for watching something or visual spatial things, that had no effect on their ability to comprehend text. The type of working memory that they need comes from listening and speaking and engaging in oral language, because you have to be able to understand what somebody's saying, edit out the parts that aren't relevant to you, synthesize information, make it meaningful to yourself, and then take in all of the background knowledge that you have from the situation and from your own life in order to make meaning from it. So there's a lot of cognitive demand that goes into oral language that is useful in reading, and they're very closely related. I think they're pretty much identical when you look at the correlations there. So if a student is struggling with their reading comprehension, go back and take a look at what their oral comprehension is. And if they have excellent oral language skills, then maybe it's an issue of needing to revisit phonics and revisit reading at the word level. It's also really important in our classes, once students have those basic reading skills, that we bring in rich texts. We can help them make sense of these texts by using graphic organizers and by having rich conversations about what we're reading so that students can build that oral language connection between comprehending from listening and comprehending from reading. Now, for students who have an IEP related to their working memory, the researchers show that it's not super advantageous to try and focus on their working memory. It's more advantageous to build their lexical quality. So go back to the previous video in this series where we talk all about lexical quality, but really building up that knowledge can help students free up working memory so that they can focus on the more complex task of reading comprehension. Another point to consider is that skilled readers know how to use different texts for different purposes. And you're probably already doing this a lot in your classes, but it's important for students to know the difference between how you would read a nonfiction text versus a fictional text. How you would approach proofreading, you need to slow down a lot more and really pay attention to the words and the spacing and the grammar, as opposed to reading poetry. And so students who are skilled readers have this knowledge. Students who are not as skilled of reading need some direction in this area to point out how they can read effectively and how they can read with a purpose. All right, so some key points to consider about reading comprehension so far. Oral language is super duper important, and it precedes the ability to even read. Listening comprehension and reading comprehension are correlated so tightly that they mimic each other when you plot them out on a graph. And reading comprehension is so super important because if students can't comprehend what they're reading, they're going to have gaps in their knowledge. Because as students advance in school, the understanding is that they can get a lot of their knowledge from reading themselves. Even if you're working in an online platform where you're using audiobooks or you're having people watch videos, that comprehension skill mimics listening skills. So if students don't have reading comprehension down, there's a good chance that they also don't have listening comprehension down. If we don't take reading comprehension seriously and we don't do all of the groundwork, so cracking the alphabetic code and working at the word level so that reading is fluent and instantaneous for children and that they understand the vocabulary that they're reading, we're going to have gaps in their knowledge. This is especially evident later on when reading becomes more independent and learning becomes more independent, because the expectation is that students can start acquiring knowledge themselves. Even if we have software to read to students, if they don't have that comprehension ability, it's so linked with listening that it's not going to matter. So handing a kid software to help them read when there's a bigger problem there with comprehension isn't going to solve the problem. Now, it is worth noting that even really skilled readers will struggle with comprehension if they don't have background knowledge in what they're reading. And a lot of that has to do with vocabulary, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So, comprehension comes from vocabulary, background knowledge, meaning activation, generating inferences, and working memory. How can we improve reading comprehension for our students? Well, the good news is that you're probably already doing most of these things in your classroom. Students need to be explicitly taught strategies that help them actively engage in the text. We can have students do this by discussing the text with peers or with teachers, and they can focus on summarizing, clarifying, predicting, and generating questions about the text. Some more good news is that once we teach these strategies to students, we don't have to keep revisiting it over and over. Once students learn the tricks of the trade, they can apply it into their own work and they don't need us to keep telling them about it over and over. Now, introducing these strategies in the lower grades is useful, but it's about grade 4 that these comprehension strategies really start to shine. And the researchers think that that's because students need to be really fluent readers before they can start to get really involved in deep comprehension with the text. And so having that baseline for being a good reader needs to come first. Remember, that doesn't mean that you can't be doing this type of activity with students when you're the reader. So if you're a primary teacher, you need to build these comprehension strategies in during your read aloud time. And then when you're doing one-on-one reading, you can just be focusing on cracking the alphabetic code and reading at the word level. If you are teaching older grades, then you can start to explicitly teach these strategies in your one-on-one reading with students because they already can read. All right, let's talk about vocabulary because this is another big part of comprehension. When students are reading, if they don't understand the vocabulary, they are going to have a heck of a time with comprehension. And so it's really important that before you introduce something new that students might not have come across, that you spend time going over the related vocabulary. For example, if you're teaching a unit on simple machines, the expectation is that students probably don't have a rich background knowledge of simple machines. Otherwise, why would we be teaching it in the class? So talk about all of the different words that students might come across, show them what the words look like so that they can map them. And this will help them to kind of be pre-activated before they go and approach a text or even before they have a discussion with you or receive a lesson from you because they've already had a bit of knowledge now of those words. And the good news is it does not take long. The research shows that less than a minute per word is more than enough for students. They pick up this stuff quite quickly. So it can be a quick run through. Here's the word, here's what it looks like, here's what it means. Let's move on. As students build their vocabularies, there's other things that we can be focusing on as teachers to help them be able to read independently. So one thing is focusing on bound Latin roots. I think that's what they're called. Things like the part of the word retro, retroactive, retrograde, so that students understand that when I see this word, this part of a word, retro, it means before or to go back or a long time ago. And so they can use that understanding to help add on to their vocabulary. An example from this research article that we're talking about today was SPECT, prospect, introspective. So when students come across these parts of words, they can use that background knowledge to help try and make sense of the vocabulary that they're interacting with. It's also really important for us as teachers to talk about words that show order or show time. So first, then, next, before, earlier, once. We take these words for granted as teachers, especially teachers that speak English as our only language, but they're really important for students to know because they're in a lot of instructions that students read. If they don't have that background knowledge in what the words mean, it can make a text really strenuous to try and get through. And then finally, we also need to be showing students words that show causality. So since, because, therefore. Those help students, again, be able to make sense of text because it's not a thing, therefore isn't something you can hold in your hand. So it's really important to show students when these words are useful and kind of what they mean in the context that we're reading. All right, so what are our takeaways here? Well, comprehension is super important for readers because or else they can't understand what they're reading. Comprehension starts before reading begins with strong oral language skills. Comprehension strategies should be taught explicitly, but it doesn't need to take a long time and we don't need to keep revisiting it over and over and over again. And finally, students need as much time to read as possible so that they can go deep with their learning and so that they can keep practicing and practicing. This helps them build their fluency and it helps build their background knowledge as they go and engage with even more text. And this does take time, so the time that you're saving on teaching strategies can be moved into time that you're letting your students read. Well, thank you so much for learning along with me today. I hope you have a great day. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with some teacher friends of yours so that YouTube remembers that teachers are interested in putting research into their classroom practice. Have a great day. Bye.